Today we're going to have a look at one of the most heartbreaking and possibly disturbing stories of human struggle and survival imaginable. This story speaks to the desperation and dire circumstances many people on this planet are forced to live into this very day. It's sure to pull at your heartstrings and put you through some serious emotional dilemmas. What the community did with this girl when they found out what she had done was to be expected, but it is what they did right at the end after they took action against her that is really profound. Stay tuned right to the end. You most certainly will be amazed. Zara sat on the rough wooden step of her father's house, staring into the dense jungle that pressed against the outskirts of their small village. The thick trees formed a green wall that seemed to close in on her, a never-ending expanse of leaves, vines, and shadows. The jungle was a place of mystery and danger, but also a place that had sustained her family for as long as she could remember. Now it felt like it was suffocating her. Her father lay inside, coughing weakly from his bed. His illness had been a slow, creeping thing that had started many months ago, back when her brother, Alain, had left for South Africa in search of work so he could support his father and sister financially. He had promised to send money, but they hadn't heard from him since he crossed the border. At first, they had been hopeful, thinking perhaps the letters were delayed or that he had simply found a job and was waiting for his first paycheck. But as the weeks turned into months, hope began to fade, leaving only the gnawing sense of abandonment. Zara always looked up to Alain. He was the strong one, the one who laughed easily and took care of Papa after Mama died. With her father growing progressively weaker, her brother had also been the only one among the three of them who had the skills to go into the jungle and source vital protein for them to eat. But now he was gone, and all that was left was her and Papa, slowly wasting away in their rundown shack on the edge of the village. They were isolated here, far enough from the village that the others didn't often come to check on them. Papa had once been a hunter, skills he later passed on to her brother, but now he was too weak to even lift his own head from the bed most days. The jungle had provided for them once, but now it seemed to mock them. Zara never learned to hunt like Papa or Alain. She wasn't trained to set traps, to track animals, or to survive in the way they once had. The meager garden they kept barely produced enough food to keep them alive, and provided greens that were severely lacking in vital nutrients they needed to survive. And then there was also the constant invasion of wildlife that raided their crops and further reduced the amount of sustenance the garden could provide. As the days passed, Zara's hunger gnawed at her belly. Her father was wasting away even faster, his body a fragile shell of what it had once been. She spent her days tending to him, bringing him water, and scouring the jungle for edible plants, but it was never enough. Each time she returned to the house, her father looked a little smaller, a little more like a ghost. Zara glanced up as a bird cawed in the distance, the sound echoing through the trees. The village was just a short walk away, but Zara rarely went there anymore. The villagers didn't speak to her much these days, especially since Alain had left. Some of them had whispered behind her back, casting suspicious glances at her when she passed. They saw her as a girl alone with a sick father and no means to support herself. Perhaps they pitied her, but no one offered help. Inside the house, her father let out a long, painful cough. Zara rose from the step and went to him, brushing a damp cloth over his forehead. His eyes, once sharp and full of life, were dull now, clouded with pain and fever. "Zara," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. We have to talk." She sat down beside him, taking his bony hand in hers. It felt so fragile, like it might break if she squeezed too hard. "What is it, Papa?" she asked softly, though she already knew. There was nothing left to say. They had been saying goodbye for weeks now. We cannot go on like this," he said, his words halting and strained. I am dying, my child. You must survive." Zara swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Papa, don't say that." He coughed again, the sound wet and ragged. "You know it's true. Alain is gone. I cannot hunt. I cannot provide. You will not survive without food." She felt the tears burning in her eyes, but she blinked them back. There was no point in crying. She had done enough of that already. "What do we do?" she whispered, though deep down she feared the answer. Her father's hand tightened weakly around hers. I will give my life, so you can live. There is no other way." Zara stared at him, horrified by the words that hung in the air. The jungle outside seemed to grow darker, the shadows pressing in. The thought of what he was suggesting sent a chill through her, but she didn't argue. She couldn't. The truth was, they had no other choice. Now, before we dive back into the heart of this dramatic jungle tragedy, pause for just a second. Make sure you are part of the next thrilling escape. Hit that subscribe button and power up your storytelling journey. And that like button? That's your ticket to unlocking even more wild twists and turns. Go ahead, I dare you. It's a game now. Now back to the story. That same night, Zara sat beside her father, staring blankly at the flickering flame of the small lantern they kept by the bed. His breathing was shallow, a raspy rattle that echoed in the small, dimly lit room. He was getting worse, much worse. The past few days had been unbearable. Zara had tried everything to stave off her hunger, searching the jungle for anything edible. The few roots and berries she found had barely lasted a day. Their small garden had been raided by animals again, leaving them with absolutely nothing. They were starving, and her father had not eaten in days. His once strong body had withered into skin and bones, barely recognizable. Zara knew what her father had proposed was the only way. He had spoken of it before, but now the moment had come, and she was filled with a sense of dread so deep it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. "Zara," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the incessant chirping of insects outside. "You must do it. Tonight." Her heart pounded in her chest. She had been dreading this moment for days, hoping that maybe, just maybe, a miracle would happen. That Alain would walk through the door, bags of food in hand, smiling like he always did. But Alain wasn't coming. He was gone, and so was their hope. Zara reached for the small wooden box on the floor beside her, the one her father had instructed her to use. Inside was a collection of dried jungle herbs, carefully selected by her father months ago when he had first fallen ill. He had taught her which plants to use, how to prepare them. At the time, she hadn't understood why he was showing her this, but now it all made sense. Her hands trembled as she picked up the bundle of herbs, their earthy smell filling the room. She had never prepared something like this before. She felt sick just thinking about it. But her father's eyes, dim and glassy with fever, watched her from the bed. He was ready. He had been ready for a long time. "Please don't hesitate," he wheezed. "You must live." Zara bit her lip, trying to steady herself. Her mind raced with memories of better times. Her father teaching her to swim in the river, her brother chasing her through the jungle, the sound of her mother's laughter before the sickness took her. She had already lost so much, and now she was about to lose her father too. With shaking hands, Zara crushed the herbs into a fine powder, just as her father had taught her. She mixed them with water from the small wooden bowl beside her, creating a thick, murky paste. This was the moment. The poison would work quickly, he had said. It would be painless. She brought the bowl to her father, her legs feeling weak beneath her. He gave her a small, sad smile, the first smile she had seen from him in weeks. "I'm proud of you," he rasped. "You are strong." Zara knelt beside the bed, holding the bowl to his lips. "I love you, Papa," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He nodded weakly, his hand trembling as he raised it to her cheek. "I love you too, my brave girl." He drank the mixture slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. When the bowl was empty, he sank back into the bed, his breathing growing more labored with each passing second. Zara sat with him, holding his hand as the poison took hold. His breaths became shallower, slower, until finally they stopped altogether. The room was silent, except for the distant sounds of the jungle outside. Her father was gone. Zara sat there for what felt like hours, staring at his still form, her heart aching with a grief so deep it felt like it would swallow her whole. She had taken her father's life, and now she was alone, truly alone. But the worst was yet to come. Zara knew what she had to do next. Her father had explained it to her, though she had never imagined she would actually have to carry out such a horrific task. She had to survive, and to do that she would need food. Her father's body was all she had. She felt nauseous at the thought, but the gnawing hunger in her belly reminded her of the reality she faced. If she didn't do this, she would die. Just like him. Slowly, almost mechanically, she rose from the bed and went to the small corner of the room where her father had kept his hunting tools. There, she found the knife he had once used to butcher animals from the jungle, animals they had eaten to survive. Now, she would use it on him. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth doing nothing to ease the coldness in her heart. She sharpened the blade with trembling hands, each scrape of the metal against stone sending shivers down her spine. This was her father, the man who had raised her, who had loved her, who had sacrificed everything for her, and now she had to butcher him like an animal. Zara closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She couldn't think about it, not if she wanted to survive. She had to detach herself from the horror of what she was about to do. It was the only way. With the knife in hand, she approached the bed. The next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise when Zara finally emerged from the small, dilapidated house. Her legs felt weak beneath her, her arms heavy and aching from the night's work. Inside, the house smelled of smoke and blood, the scent of death mingling with the damp air of the jungle. Her father's body, or what remained of it, had been prepared, just as he had instructed her. She had done it. She had cut the meat from his bones with the same knife he had once used to feed them. The process had been slow, agonizing, but she had pushed through the horror, her mind numb to the reality of it all. She couldn't afford to think about what she had done, not if she wanted to keep going. The meat was now smoking in the small pit her father had built outside, the thick clouds of smoke rising into the early morning sky. It would take hours for the meat to dehydrate to a sufficient state of preservation, but once it was done, she would have enough to survive, at least for a while. Zara wiped her hands on her tattered dress, the dark stains of blood still clinging to her skin. Her stomach churned at the thought of eating what she had prepared, but hunger gnawed at her relentlessly. It had been days since she had eaten anything substantial, and the small bits of food she had found in the jungle were nowhere near enough to sustain her. She sat down on the ground beside the smoking pit, exhaustion washing over her. Her mind was a blur of images, her father's face as he took his last breath, the sound of the knife cutting through flesh, the heavy silence of the house after it was all done. She wanted to cry, to scream, to tear the world apart for what it had done to her, but she didn't have the energy. All she could do was sit and wait, her body too drained to move. The jungle around her was alive with sound, birds calling from the treetops, insects buzzing through the air, the distant rustling of animals in the undergrowth. It was the same jungle that had always been there, the same one that had provided for her family for years. But now it felt different, darker, more threatening, as if the jungle itself had turned against her. She thought of Alain, her brother, and wondered where he was. Was he still alive? Had he made it to South Africa, found work, and forgotten all about them? Or was he lying in a ditch somewhere, dead and alone, just like their father? The thought made her stomach twist with anger. How could he have abandoned them like this? He had promised to come back, to send money, to help them survive, but he hadn't. He had left her to fend for herself, left her to watch their father waste away and die. A sudden rustling in the bushes nearby made her jump. Zara grabbed the knife from beside her, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment she thought it might be a wild animal, something that had smelled the smoke and came to investigate. But then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was one of the villagers, a young man named Kojo who lived a few houses down from them. He had been a friend of Alain's once, though they hadn't spoken much since her brother had left. He looked surprised to see her, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of the smoking pit and the blood-stained knife in her hand. "Zara, what are you doing?" Zara froze, her mind racing. She hadn't expected anyone to come here, hadn't thought that anyone would care enough to check on her, but now Kojo was here, and he was looking at her with confusion. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. I'm smoking meat," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get the meat?" Zara's heart pounded in her chest, her mind scrambling for an answer. She couldn't tell him the truth, not if she wanted to survive. If the villagers found out what she had done, they would surely turn on her. Cannibalism was taboo, a crime punishable by death. She had no doubt that they would kill her if they knew. "I found it. In the jungle. I found a dead female gorilla in the jungle." Kojo didn't look convinced. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he examined the pit. The smoke curled up around him, thick and acrid, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of cooking meat. Zara gripped the knife tighter, her palms slick with sweat. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to explain away the horror of what she had done. She had killed her father. She had butchered him. And now she was eating him. How could she ever make that sound right? "Zara, that's not meat from a gorilla, is it?" Her stomach twisted, and she felt bile rise in her throat. She couldn't lie anymore. There was no point. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "It's not." Kojo's face paled, his eyes widening in horror. For a moment he just stared at her, as if he couldn't quite comprehend what she had said. Then slowly he backed away, his hands trembling. You ate him," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You ate your father." Zara's breath caught in her throat, her body shaking with the weight of his words. She wanted to deny it, to say that it wasn't true, but she couldn't. The truth hung between them like a heavy, suffocating cloud. "I had to," she said, her voice breaking. "I had no choice. He was dying and we had no food. I had to survive." Kojo shook his head, his face twisted in horror. This is wrong, Zara. You can't do this." Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the knife to her chest, her body trembling with fear and grief. "I had no choice," she cried. "I had no one else. I'm alone." Kojo turned and ran, disappearing into the jungle before she could stop him. Zara collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. She had been discovered. It was only a matter of time before the villagers found out, and when they did, they would kill her too. A short while later, Zara sat huddled in the corner of her small house, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers of the fire that still smoldered in the hearth. Outside, the jungle was alive with the sounds, but inside there was only silence. She hadn't moved from that position since she came to sit there after Kojo had left. The weight of what she had done, of what he now knew, hung over her like a dark cloud. He would tell the others. She knew it. It was only a matter of time before the villagers came for her, armed with torches and weapons, ready to exact their vengeance. Her father's body, or what remained of it, was still in the smoke pit where she had placed it earlier. Zara saw no point in trying to hide it. They would find it, they would see the truth, and then they would kill her. The thought sent a cold wave of fear through her, but there was nothing she could do now. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. Then a sudden knock at the door startled her out of her thoughts. Zara's heart leapt into her throat as she scrambled to her feet, her body trembling with fear. The knock came again, louder this time. Zara recognized the voice. It was the village elder, Mosi, a man who had known her family for years. He had always been kind to them, but now there was a sternness in his voice that sent a shiver down her spine. Zara hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch. She knew what awaited her if she opened the door, but there was no use hiding. They would break it down if she didn't let them in. With a deep breath, she unlocked the door and pulled it open. Mosi stood on the doorstep, flanked by several other villagers, their faces grim and cold. Kojo was there too, standing at the back of the group, his eyes avoiding hers. "We know what you've done. Kojo told us everything." Zara's heart sank, her body trembling as she stepped back from the door. The villagers filed into the house, their eyes scanning the small room, taking in the blood-stained floor and the remnants of the fire. Mosi looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Why, Zara? Why did you do this?" Tears welled up in Zara's eyes. She could feel the eyes of the other villagers burning into her, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the crackling of the last dying embers in the hearth. Mosi's question hung in the air, heavy and accusing. Zara swallowed hard, her throat dry, her voice trembling as she struggled to find the words. I had no choice. He was dying. There was no food. I had to survive. I didn't want to do it, but My father insisted. The villagers exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief. Some of them shook their heads, muttering under their breath, while others stared at Zara with wide eyes, as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. Mosi stepped forward, his weathered face etched with sorrow. He had known Zara's father for years, had seen him raise his children with love and care. Now, the thought of what she had done, the ultimate betrayal, seemed too much for him to comprehend. There must have been another way. "You could have come to us. We would have helped you. You didn't have to do this." Zara's tears spilled over, her body shaking with sobs. "I didn't know what else to do. My father told me to... He told me to end his suffering. And after... I couldn't think straight. The hunger, the desperation, it clouded my mind. I thought it was the only way." Mosi's face softened for a moment, his eyes searching hers for any sign of the girl he had once known. But all he saw now was a broken shell of a young girl, her innocence shattered by the horrors of survival. "We understand desperation, Zara," Mosi said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But what you've done, it's against everything we stand for, against nature, against our traditions." Zara wiped her face with the back of her hand, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I know what I did was wrong, but I didn't have anyone else. I couldn't bear to watch him suffer anymore, and I had nothing. No food, no hope. I just wanted to live." The villagers murmured amongst themselves, their whispers filling the small room like the rustling of leaves in the wind. Some seemed moved by Zara's desperation, others clearly horrified by the taboo she had broken. Mosi sighed heavily, turning to face the rest of the group. "This is not a decision we can make lightly," he said, his voice carrying authority. "She is one of our own, but she has committed a grievous act. We cannot ignore what she has done." One of the older women, her face lined with years of hardship, stepped forward. "She was desperate," the woman said, her voice rough but steady. "She's young, alone. We've all lost family. We all know what it's like to be pushed to the brink. Should we not show her compassion?" A younger man, his face twisted with disgust, spoke up angrily. "Compassion? She ate her father. She should be punished, not pitied." The room erupted into a chaotic mix of voices, some shouting for punishment, others calling for mercy. Zara stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, as the villagers argued over her fate. It felt as if the walls were closing in on her, the weight of their judgment too much to bear. Mosey raised his hand, silencing the crowd. Enough, he said firmly. We must make our decision together, as a community. Zara's legs trembled beneath her as she stood before them, waiting for her sentence. The air in the room felt thick and oppressive, the tension palpable. She knew there was no going back. What she had done couldn't be undone, and now her life hung in the balance. Mosey turned to Zara, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. Zara, the decision is not mine alone to make. But know this, the villagers are divided. Some wish to banish you, others want to see you punished for what you've done. I will give you a chance to speak one last time. Tell us why we should spare you. Zara's mind raced. She thought of her father, the nights they had spent huddled together as he grew weaker and weaker. She thought of the hunger that gnawed at her, the desperation that drove her to commit the unthinkable. And she thought of the life she still wanted to live, the faint hope that somehow she could survive this. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she said, her voice shaking but steady. I know what I've done, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life, but please, I want to live. I want to make things right. My father didn't want me to die here, alone in the jungle. He wanted me to survive. That's why he asked me to do what I did. I know it's wrong, but I did it to honor his last wish. Her voice faltered, and she looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each villager. I'm begging you. Don't take my life because of a choice I made in my darkest moment. I don't know what will happen to me if I'm banished, but I'll be alone. I'll have no chance of surviving. Please, help me. We will vote, Mosey said. Each person here will have a say. Zara, your fate rests in the hands of this village. The villagers began to murmur among themselves, and one by one, they approached Mosey to cast their vote. Some whispered words of compassion, others spoke harshly, their faces set in anger and disgust. Zara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the process unfold, her life hanging by a thread. She couldn't read their expressions, couldn't tell which way the vote would go. When the last villager had spoken, Mosey turned back to Zara, his expression unreadable. The village has made its decision, he said quietly. Zara's breath caught in her throat. This was it. Her entire life, her future, hung on the next few words that Mosey would say. We will not kill you, Mosey said, his voice low but firm. But you are banished from this village. You will leave at dawn and never return. Zara's knees buckled, relief and fear flooding her body all at once. They wouldn't kill her. She would live. But the thought of being cast out into the jungle, alone and with no one to turn to, filled her with dread. You have until morning to gather your things, Mosey continued. After that you must go, and if you ever return, the punishment will be death. Zara nodded numbly, her mind spinning. She had survived, but at what cost? As the villagers filed out of the house, leaving her alone in the flickering light of the dying fire, Zara collapsed to the ground, her body shaking with sobs. She had survived, but her life would never be the same again. The night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion, the weight of her banishment settling heavy on Zara's chest. As the hours dragged on, she sat huddled by the dying fire, staring into the smoldering embers, her mind numb to the reality of what was to come. She had no time to process her grief. Her father's death, the horror of what she had done, the finality of being cast out from the only home she had ever known. At dawn, the village was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of morning, birds singing, the chatter of villagers beginning their day, were absent, replaced by a suffocating silence. It was as if the jungle itself knew what had happened, and it mourned with her. Zara packed what little she had, a few scraps of clothing, her father's knife, and the smoked meat that still hung over the pit outside. The smell of it turned her stomach, a brutal reminder of her desperate act, but she couldn't afford to waste anything. She would need every ounce of food if she hoped to survive in the wilderness. As she slung the small bundle over her shoulder, she took one last look around the house. It felt surreal. This had been her home for her entire life, and now she was leaving it behind forever. The walls that had once felt so familiar now seemed cold and distant, the memories of her childhood tainted by the events of the past few days. She stepped outside, blinking in the pale light of dawn. The jungle loomed in front of her, dark and foreboding, the towering trees casting long shadows over the path that led away from the village. It would be her new home now, whether she liked it or not. Mosey was waiting for her at the edge of the village, along with a few of the elders. Their faces were solemn, their eyes avoiding hers. No one spoke as she approached, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. Zara stopped a few feet away from them, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel their judgment, their unspoken condemnation hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Mosey cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You know the terms of your exile," he said, his voice low and steady. "You are to leave this village and never return. We have no more to say." Zara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She wanted to plead with them, to ask for some form of mercy or understanding, but she knew it was futile. Their decision had been made, and nothing she said would change it. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the jungle, her legs trembling beneath her. The path was narrow and overgrown, the thick vegetation pressing in on either side as she made her way deeper into the forest. The sound of her footsteps was muffled by the soft earth beneath her feet, the dense canopy overhead blocking out most of the morning light. As she walked, the village faded into the distance, swallowed by the jungle. She was alone now, truly and completely. The realization hit her with full force, and for a moment she stopped, her chest tightening with panic. What was she going to do? How was she going to survive out here, with no shelter, no allies, no hope? The jungle was vast and unforgiving, filled with dangers she could barely comprehend. Wild animals, venomous snakes, and the relentless elements, any one of them could end her life in an instant. But she couldn't turn back. There was no home to return to, no one waiting for her with open arms. The villagers had cast her out, and now she had to make her own way, no matter how terrifying the prospect. Zara forced herself to keep walking, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. The jungle seemed to close in around her, the dense trees and underbrush creating a claustrophobic tunnel that stretched endlessly in front of her. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent her heart racing, her hand gripping the knife at her side with white-knuckled desperation. Hours passed, though it felt like an eternity. The heat of the day pressed down on her, the humidity clinging to her skin like a second layer. Sweat dripped down her forehead, mingling with the dirt and grime that covered her from head to toe. She was exhausted, her limbs heavy with fatigue, but she didn't dare stop. Not yet. By midday, she had found a small clearing by a stream, the cool water trickling over smooth rocks in a soothing rhythm. She knelt beside it, cupping her hands to drink, the cold water refreshing her parched throat. For a brief moment, the fear and desperation melted away, replaced by a small glimmer of relief. At least she had water. But she couldn't linger here for long. She needed shelter, a place to rest and think. The jungle was vast, and without a plan, she would be as good as dead. Zara spent the rest of the afternoon searching for a suitable spot to set up camp. She found a small cluster of trees near the stream, their thick branches creating a natural shelter from the elements. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Using her father's knife, she cut down branches and leaves, creating a crude shelter to shield her from the worst of the weather. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. A small, temporary reprieve from the harsh reality of the jungle. As night fell, the jungle came alive with the sounds of insects and animals, their calls echoing through the trees. The darkness was thick and oppressive, the shadows deepening as the last rays of sunlight disappeared over the horizon. Zara huddled in her makeshift shelter, clutching the knife in her hand, her ears straining to catch any sound of approaching danger. Her stomach growled, reminding her of the smoked meat she had packed. She hesitated for a moment, her hands trembling as she unwrapped the small bundle. The smell of it hit her immediately, a mix of smoke and flesh that made her stomach churn. She couldn't forget what it was, who it was, but hunger won out in the end. With shaky hands, she tore off a small piece and forced herself to chew, her throat tight as she swallowed. The taste was bitter, the texture strange and foreign, but it filled the gnawing emptiness in her belly. It would sustain her for now. As she ate, her thoughts drifted back to the village. She wondered what they were doing now, if they were thinking of her, if they regretted their decision. But deep down, she knew they didn't. She was a reminder of something dark, something they would rather forget. And now, she was out here, forgotten by all of them. Tears stung her eyes as she lay down on the cold ground, her body curled into a tight ball. The jungle loomed around her, vast and indifferent, its darkness swallowing her whole. She felt small, insignificant, a lone figure lost in the endless expanse of the wild. She didn't know what the future held for her now. Survival seemed like an impossible task, the weight of her actions pressing down on her with every passing moment. But she had no choice. She had to keep going, had to survive, if only because her father had asked her to. As she drifted off to sleep, the sounds of the jungle filled her ears, lulling her into a restless, uneasy slumber. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but for now, she could do nothing but wait, and hope that somehow she would find a way to survive. The next few days blurred together as Zara adapted to her new life in the jungle. Every day was a battle for survival, a delicate balance between finding food, avoiding predators, and staying hidden from the world that had cast her out. Her body grew leaner, her skin tougher, the soft edges of her former self eroding away fast. The smoked meat was lasting her longer than she expected, though every bite had been a painful reminder of what she had done. But necessity had a way of dulling even the sharpest guilt, and over time the act of eating became just another means of survival. She avoided the village, keeping her distance from the people who had once been her family and friends. There was no place for her there now. She was an outcast, a ghost in the jungle, living on the fringes of a world that had moved on without her. Then one late afternoon, as she sat beside a small fire, roasting roots she had dug from the earth, Zara heard something that made her freeze. A distant voice, human, calling her name. At first she thought she was imagining it, a trick of the wind. But then she heard it again, closer this time. Zara! The voice was faint but unmistakable. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. No one from the village had sought her out since her exile. Why would they be looking for her now? Did they decide to kill her after all? The voices grew louder, more distinct, accompanied by the sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Panic surged through Zara's veins. Should she run? Hide? The villagers had made their decision. She was banished, an outcast. Why would they be looking for her now? But something inside her, a small flicker of hope that had long been buried, kept her rooted in place. She stood there, waiting, as the voices drew nearer. The first face to emerge from the trees was Mosey's. His weathered features were drawn with concern, his eyes scanning the clearing until they landed on her. Behind him, a group of villagers followed, their expressions a mixture of relief and guilt. Zara's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say, her mind reeling with confusion. What were they doing here? Mosey stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Zara, he said, his voice low and soft. We've been searching for you. Why? Zara's voice cracked, the question escaping before she could stop it. You banished me. You told me to never return. Mosey nodded, his face etched with regret. We made a terrible mistake. We were scared. Scared of what you had done, and of the darkness we thought had consumed you. But we've had time to think, and we realize now. We were wrong to send you away. Zara's heart pounded in her chest, her emotions a whirlwind of disbelief, anger, and longing. She had spent so long convincing herself that she was truly alone, that there was no going back. And yet, here they were, standing before her, asking her to return. It turns out that after she left the next morning, more villagers became involved with the discussion about what Zara did, turning it into a days-long tug-of-war between those who took pity on her and those who wanted her gone. In the end, the majority of the villagers agreed that they should help a child that had reached this level of desperation, rather than punish her further. One of the older women, the same one who had spoken up during her trial, stepped forward. We thought you were lost to us, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. But we've seen now that you did what you had to do. It wasn't right. But you are still one of us, Zara. We cannot let you stay out here alone. As more people started to speak to her, tears welled up in Zara's eyes, blurring the faces of the villagers as they stood before her. The memories of her father, the weight of her actions, the loneliness she had endured, it all came crashing down at once, overwhelming her. She had survived, but it had come at a cost. She didn't know if she deserved their forgiveness. I don't know if I can come back, Zara whispered, her voice shaking. I don't know how to live among you anymore. Mosey stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. You won't be alone, he said gently. We will help you. We should have helped you from the beginning. The villagers nodded in agreement, their faces softening with empathy. They had come to understand the depth of her suffering, the impossible choice she had been forced to make. Zara hesitated for a long moment, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. But as she looked into their faces, she saw something she hadn't expected. Acceptance. Maybe even a chance for healing. Slowly, she nodded. All right, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'll come back. With that, the villagers gathered around her, offering their hands to help her carry her meager belongings. Together, they walked back toward the village, the jungle slowly fading behind them. For the first time in months, Zara wasn't alone. She was going home. Now, do you believe Zara will ever find peace with what she's done, or will it haunt her forever? Also, let us know what moment stood out the most for you in this story. And remember, subscribing to the channel will prevent you from having to search for mind-blowing real-life stories to listen to in the future. We post brand new real-life stories every Wednesday and Sunday, so hit that button. It's your ticket to endless fun. And if you have some more time to relax, the story on your screen will most certainly give you a tingling feeling in the pit of your stomach as this ex-Navy SEAL kicks the ass of a thug that dared to hurt his daughter. As always, much love and stay safe.